Narcissist loses an empath and suddenly the game changes. Not the loud, dramatic kind of change, but the quiet, spiritual kind that shakes a person from the inside. What happens when the one person who absorbed the chaos, forgave the lies, and kept loving through the storms finally walks away? Does the narcissist move on like nothing happened? Or does something deeper begin to crack beneath the mask? Carl Jung once said that until we face our shadow, it will control our lives. So what happens when the empath, who carried that shadow, is no longer there to hold it? Is this the narcissist's collapse, or the beginning of an ego death they never chose? And here's the real question: who truly transforms in the end? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear might completely change how you see toxic relationships, power, and spiritual awakening. If you've ever experienced this dynamic, don't just watch silently. Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the mirror someone else needs to finally see the truth. When a narcissist loses an empath, what collapses is not just a relationship, it is a mirror. The empath was never simply a partner, a lover, or a friend. They were reflections surface, constantly absorbing, validating, soothing, and confirming the narcissist's carefully constructed identity. Narcissists do not build a stable sense of self from within. Instead, they construct it through reflection. They discover who they are by watching how others respond to them. Admiration becomes proof of superiority. Attention becomes proof of importance. Emotional reactions become proof of power. And the empath, with their deep sensitivity and emotional generosity, becomes the perfect mirror. They see potential. They see pain beneath arrogance. They see wounds beneath control. And in trying to love the narcissist into wholeness, they unknowingly reinforce the illusion that the narcissist is grand, misunderstood, and deserving of endless patience. The empath provides validation without exhaustion, at least in the beginning. They listen longer, forgive faster, stay when others leave. They offer admiration, reassurance, and emotional supply in a steady stream. For the narcissist, this feels stabilizing. It feels like identity. But this identity is not rooted in authenticity. It is rooted in reflection. It is like standing in front of a mirror and believing the image is the self. As long as the mirror remains, the illusion holds. As long as someone is reflecting admiration back, the fragile ego feels solid. This is why the departure of an empath is not experienced as a simple breakup. It is experienced as destabilization. Something essential has disappeared. When the empath leaves, the narcissist does not just lose a person, they lose the reflection that held their ego together. Suddenly, there is no one cushioning their insecurity, no one translating their harshness into hidden pain, no one constantly proving their worth through attention. The silence that follows can feel unbearable. Without the empath's emotional feedback, the narcissist is left alone with their own internal world, and that world is often far emptier than they are prepared to face. What once felt powerful now feels restless. What once felt controlled now feels exposed. The collapse is internal before it is external. Carl Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This statement holds a powerful truth about projection and self-awareness. In many narcissistic dynamics, the narcissist projects vulnerability, weakness, and neediness onto the empath. They reject these traits in themselves, so they attach to someone who embodies compassion and emotional depth. The empath carries the very qualities the narcissist has disowned. But here is the critical difference. While Jung saw irritation and projection as pathways towards self-understanding, narcissists often avoid that path. Instead of turning inward, they outsource self-understanding. They rely on others to regulate their emotions, define their value, and stabilize their identity. As long as the empath remains, self-reflection is unnecessary. There is no reason to confront insecurity if someone else is constantly reassuring you. There is no reason to face shame if someone else is constantly forgiving you. But when the empath walks away, the outsourcing stops. The emotional buffer disappears. And spiritually, this is where something profound happens. the illusion begins to collapse. The collapse of illusion is not dramatic on the surface. The narcissist may appear unaffected. They may quickly seek new validation, new supply, new admiration. But internally something has shifted, the old mirror is gone. And without that specific reflection, the one that saw them as wounded yet special, flawed yet exceptional, the narcissist feels an unsettling void. This void is what makes the loss spiritually significant. It is not about missing the empath's love. It is about confronting the absence of self. Without the empath, the narcissist faces something terrifying, the empty self. The grand image they believed in begins to flicker without constant reinforcement. Doubt creeps in. Restlessness grows. There is often anger, not because of heartbreak in the traditional sense, but because the source of stabilization has vanished. The ego, once inflated through reflection, now struggles to maintain its shape. And here lies the spiritual crossroads. The empty self can either be avoided or explored. If avoided, the narcissist will quickly seek another mirror, another empathic personality willing to reflect admiration and absorb projection. The cycle repeats and the illusion is rebuilt. But if explored, even briefly, the emptiness can become a doorway. In Jungian psychology, confronting the shadow is painful but necessary for growth. It requires acknowledging the insecurity, fear, and vulnerability that were once denied. It requires recognizing that identity built purely on reflection is unstable. This confrontation feels like collapse, but it is actually the beginning of something real. The tragedy is that many narcissists never stay long enough in that discomfort to transform. The emptiness feels too threatening, the silence feels too loud, and so they escape into distraction, superiority, or blame. Yet spiritually, the moment remains significant. When the narcissist loses the empath, the universe removes the mirror. What remains is either panic or possibility. Because without reflection, there is only one place left to look: within. When a narcissist loses an empath, something invisible but powerful is severed. It is not just emotional distance or physical separation. It feels like an energetic cord has been cut. Throughout the relationship, the empath was not only giving time and affection, they were giving energy, steady, focused, emotional energy. Empaths naturally tune into other people's feelings. They listen deeply, forgive repeatedly, and try to understand what others cannot express. In a healthy connection, this creates warmth and balance. But in a narcissistic dynamic, that same energy becomes fuel. The narcissist absorbs attention, validation, reassurance, and emotional reactions as a way to regulate themselves. They may appear confident on the outside, but internally they depend on external input to stabilize their mood and identity. The empath becomes the emotional power source. Over time, this exchange forms what feels like an energetic cord. The empath gives encouragement when the narcissist feels insecure. They offer admiration when the narcissist feels unseen. They provide forgiveness when the narcissist behaves poorly. They respond to messages quickly, explain themselves patiently, and try to repair conflicts even when they were not the cause. All of this creates a steady flow of emotional supply. The narcissist becomes used to this rhythm. It soothes them. It distracts them from deeper emptiness. It keeps their self-image intact. They may not consciously think, "I need this person to survive," but on a psychological and spiritual level, they are feeding on that connection. Then one day, the empath detaches. Sometimes it happens slowly, after months of exhaustion. Sometimes it happens suddenly, after a final betrayal. But when it happens, the energetic cord breaks. The flow stops. There are no more long emotional conversations. No more reassurance. No more immediate reactions to provoke. The silence that follows is not peaceful for the narcissist. It feels like withdrawal. Spiritually, the narcissist experiences something similar to detox. When someone has relied on a steady supply of emotional energy and that supply disappears, the system reacts. There is restlessness, a feeling that something is off. They may check their phone more often. They may think about the empath unexpectedly. They may feel irritated without understanding why. This is not always love resurfacing. Often, it is the nervous system reacting to the loss of regulation. The empath used to absorb their stress and calm their fears. Without that outlet, uncomfortable emotions rise to the surface. Withdrawal does not look soft. It often looks aggressive. Panic is masked as anger. The narcissist may speak badly about the empath, blame them for being too sensitive or ungrateful, or suddenly act as if the relationship meant nothing. Indifference becomes a performance. They tell others they have moved on easily. They post pictures, appear happy, or quickly attach to someone new. But underneath that surface is agitation. When supply is removed, the ego scrambles to protect itself. The anger is not always about the empath leaving, it is about losing control over the flow of energy. There can also be obsession disguised as indifference. The narcissist may pretend not to care, yet quietly monitor the empath's life. They may ask mutual friends questions. They may attempt subtle contact, testing whether the cord can be reattached. This behavior is not necessarily driven by deep romantic longing. It is driven by craving. When a person has grown accustomed to emotional feeding, silence feels threatening. The mind looks for ways to restore balance. It is important to understand that what the narcissist often misses is not love in its pure form. Love requires mutual vulnerability, empathy, and accountability. What they miss is supply, the steady stream of attention, admiration, an emotional response that kept their inner instability under control. Without it, they must face their own unregulated feelings. And for someone who has built identity around external validation, this feels like starvation. Spiritually, starvation does not always mean collapse. Sometimes it creates awareness. When the empath's energy is no longer available, the narcissist stands alone with their own emotional hunger. They can attempt to immediately replace the source, finding another empathic personality to reconnect the cord. Or in rare cases, they can begin to question why they feel so empty without constant validation. That question is uncomfortable, but it holds potential for growth. Detox is painful because it exposes dependency. It forces the system to operate without its usual stimulant. For the empath, the cutting of the cord often feels different. There may be grief, but there is also relief. Energy returns to the body, sleep improves, anxiety slowly decreases. They begin to realize how much of themselves they were giving away. Spiritually, their system recalibrates. But for the narcissist, the first phase is chaos. Restlessness turns into distraction. Panic turns into pride. Obsession turns into denial. The outside world may not see this struggle because narcissists are skilled at maintaining image. Yet internally, the absence of supply echoes loudly. In the end, the spiritual detox reveals a simple truth. When connection is based on extraction rather than mutual exchange, separation feels like deprivation. The narcissist may call it betrayal, overreaction, or abandonment, but beneath those labels is something more basic: hunger. And when the energetic cord is cut, that hunger can no longer be ignored. When a narcissist loses an empath, something deeper than heartbreak begins to stir. It is not just the loss of attention or admiration, it is the awakening of the shadow. Carl Jung described the shadow as the hidden part of the personality, the side we deny, reject, or refuse to see in ourselves. These are the traits we consider weak, shameful, or unacceptable. Instead of acknowledging them, we push them into the unconscious. But what we bury does not disappear. It finds expression in other ways, often through projection. We see in others what we cannot accept in ourselves. In narcissistic dynamics, this projection becomes intense and constant. The empath often carries the narcissist's rejected shadow without realizing it. The narcissist disowns weakness, vulnerability, and emotional neediness. They build an identity around strength, superiority, and control. Admitting insecurity would shatter that image. Admitting fear would threaten the mask. So those softer, wounded parts are pushed away, yet they do not vanish. Instead, the narcissist unconsciously attaches to someone who embodies emotional depth and openness. The empath feels deeply, expresses care freely, and is not ashamed of sensitivity. These qualities are everything the narcissist has buried. Rather than integrating them, the narcissist projects them outward. This projection creates a strange balance. The empath becomes the emotional container for the relationship. They carry the tears, the conversations about feelings, the desire for closeness. If the narcissist feels insecure, they may accuse the empath of being too needy. If they feel afraid of abandonment, they may accuse the empath of being clingy. What is happening beneath the surface is psychological displacement. The narcissist is placing their rejected traits onto the empath, then reacting to them as if they exist only outside themselves. Meanwhile, the empath, driven by compassion, absorbs these accusations and tries to improve, to heal, to love harder. Over time, the empath nurtures the very wounds the narcissist refuses to acknowledge. They reassure them when they feel unseen. They stay when the narcissist tests loyalty. They forgive behavior rooted in fear. In a way, the empath becomes the shadow's caretaker. They hold the vulnerability the narcissist cannot face. As long as the empath remains in this role, the projection stays intact. The narcissist does not have to confront insecurity directly because it appears to live in someone else. The illusion feels stable. But when the empath leaves, the projection collapses. The emotional container disappears. There is no longer someone willing to carry the disowned traits. And suddenly, the qualities that were blamed on the empath have nowhere to go. The insecurity resurfaces internally. The abandonment wound becomes visible. The fear of insignificance, once hidden behind arrogance, begins to whisper more loudly. This is the moment Jung would describe a shadow confrontation. The denied parts of the personality move closer to consciousness. Spiritually, this is a powerful and uncomfortable turning point. The narcissist now stands alone with aspects of themselves they have avoided for years. Without the empath to project onto, they may begin to feel exposed. They might notice jealousy they once accused the empath of having. They might feel deep loneliness they once mocked. They might sense the fragile self-esteem beneath their grand image. The shadow is no longer safely external. It is internal, pressing for recognition. Shadow confrontation is not gentle. It feels like inner conflict. The ego resists, pride argues, blame tries to redirect responsibility. The narcissist may attempt to reattach the projection by quickly finding a new empathic partner. They may intensify criticism toward the former partner, trying to push the shadow back onto them through anger. They may distract themselves with work, status, or attention from others. All of these are avoidance strategies. Facing the shadow requires humility, and humility threatens the identity they have built. Yet within this confrontation lies potential transformation. Jung believed that integrating the shadow is essential for psychological growth. It does not mean becoming weak. It means acknowledging that vulnerability exists. It means accepting insecurity without projecting it. For a narcissist, this would require admitting fear of abandonment, recognizing the need for validation, and understanding that the craving for admiration comes from a deeper wound. It would require seeing that the empath was not too sensitive, but rather reflecting parts of themselves they could not accept. Here is the difficult truth: most narcissists run from this process. The discomfort feels too intense. The ego fights to survive. Instead of integrating the shadow, they rebuild the mask. They search for new mirrors. They reestablish projection patterns. The opportunity for growth passes, at least for now. The shadow retreats again into the unconscious, waiting for another crisis to bring it forward. But even if they run, the confrontation leaves a mark. Something has been revealed. The collapse of projection creates a crack in the illusion. Whether they choose to ignore it or explore it determines the path ahead. Spiritually, losing the empath is not just a relational event, it is a summons to self-awareness. It is an invitation to reclaim the parts of the soul that were disowned and scattered onto others. In the end, the shadow does not disappear because we refuse to see it. It waits. And when the empath who once carried it walks away, the narcissist is left with a choice: continue running from the darkness within, or finally turn around and face it. When a narcissist loses an empath, the experience can feel like something far more dramatic than a breakup. On the surface, it may look like anger, blame, or cold indifference. But beneath that reaction, something much deeper is happening. The departure of the empath often triggers an involuntary ego death, not the kind chosen through spiritual practice or self-reflection, but one forced by circumstance. The structure they built around admiration, control, and validation begins to crack. And because it was never built on a stable inner foundation, the collapse feels threatening. For a spiritually unaware narcissist, this does not feel like growth. It feels like betrayal. They may say, "After everything I did for you." They may frame themselves as the victim of abandonment. They may describe the empath's leaving as cruel, dramatic, or unjust. The narrative becomes one of unfairness. In their mind, they were entitled to loyalty, to admiration, to emotional support without limits. The idea that someone could walk away from them challenges their entire self-image. It feels like injustice because it contradicts the belief that they should always be chosen. But spiritually, something very different is happening. What feels like betrayal on the surface is actually initiation. The empath's departure removes the constant stream of validation that kept the ego inflated. Without someone reflecting back admiration and importance, the narcissist must confront the space underneath the image. Ego death is not physical destruction, it is the collapse of a false identity. It is the realization that the version of self built on external worship cannot sustain itself alone. The universe, in its own mysterious way, often removes what is no longer meant to continue. When the lesson within a dynamic is complete, the connection dissolves. The empath may leave because they have learned to value themselves. They may leave because the cycle of giving without receiving has become too painful. From a spiritual perspective, this departure is not random. It signals that the imbalance has reached its limit. The mirror is taken away. The energy exchange stops, and what remains is silence. In that silence, a powerful question rises: who am I without someone worshipping me? For the narcissist, this question can feel terrifying. If identity was built on admiration, attention, and control, then without those things, what is left? The ego scrambles to defend itself. It may seek immediate replacement, looking for someone new to provide validation. It may rewrite history, convincing itself that the empath was the problem all along. It may inflate further, acting even more superior to avoid feeling small. These are protective reactions. They are attempts to prevent the full experience of ego death. True ego death requires surrender. It requires admitting that the image was fragile. It requires acknowledging dependency on external praise. For someone who has spent years avoiding vulnerability, this feels unbearable. The collapse of the ego feels like humiliation. It feels like exposure. It feels like standing without armor. That is why so many narcissists interpret this moment as injustice rather than initiation. They see loss, not opportunity. Yet initiation is exactly what it is. Throughout spiritual traditions, ego death is described as a gateway to transformation. The old identity must dissolve for a more authentic one to emerge. When the empath leaves, the narcissist stands at that gateway. They can continue defending the mask, or they can begin to question it. They can ask themselves why admiration feels necessary for stability. They can explore the fear that surfaces when they are alone. They can examine the deep need to be seen as superior. These questions are uncomfortable, but they are powerful. Very few narcissists answer them honestly. Honesty requires humility. It requires admitting insecurity, abandonment, wounds, and fear of insignificance. It requires recognizing that love cannot survive where control dominates. Many will avoid this path. They will rebuild the ego quickly, attaching to new sources of validation. The crisis will pass, and the illusion will be restored, at least temporarily. But for the rare few who stay in the discomfort, something remarkable can happen. If they allow the ego to soften instead of harden, transformation begins. They may start to see the empath not as a betrayer, but as a mirror that once reflected both light and shadow. They may recognize how much they relied on admiration to feel whole. They may begin to build identity from within rather than from applause. This process is slow and often painful, but it is real growth. Ego death is never comfortable. It strips away illusions. It removes false power. It exposes insecurity. Yet it also opens the possibility of authenticity. When the narcissist loses the empath, they are not simply losing a partner. They are being confronted with the difference between image and essence. The universe does not force transformation, but it presents the opportunity. The empath's departure becomes a turning point. It asks a question that cannot be ignored forever. If no one is there to worship you, who are you really? And in the quiet space that follows, the answer waits to be discovered. When a narcissist loses an empath, most people focus on what happens to the narcissist, but the real spiritual shift happens in the empath. The true transformation, the deeper awakening, begins the moment the empath decides they have had enough. For a long time, the empath may have believed the relationship was their responsibility to fix. They may have thought that with enough love, patience, and understanding, the narcissist would finally feel safe enough to change. They gave chances. They explained their feelings calmly. They tolerated behavior that slowly drained them. What they did not realize at first was that they were abandoning themselves in the process. When the empath finally leaves, something powerful happens. They reclaim their energy. All the emotional effort they poured into managing someone else's moods, defending their intentions, and proving their loyalty begins to return to them. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. There can be silence where chaos once lived. There can be guilt where obligation once ruled. But beneath that discomfort is relief. The constant tension of walking on eggshells fades. The nervous system begins to calm. The empath starts to notice how much of their life revolved around stabilizing someone who refused to stabilize themselves. One of the most important shifts during this awakening is the breaking of trauma bonds. Trauma bonds are not built on healthy love. They are built on cycles of pain and reward. Moments of affection are followed by criticism. Apologies are followed by repeated harm. The unpredictability creates attachment. The empath holds on, believing the good moments are proof of potential. But when they step away and create distance, clarity slowly replaces confusion. They begin to see patterns instead of promises. They recognize manipulation where they once saw misunderstanding. This clarity is not bitterness, it is awareness. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For a long time, the empath may have called the relationship fate. They may have believed they were meant to save this person, meant to endure, meant to love unconditionally no matter the cost. But when they step back and reflect, they start making the unconscious conscious. They see their own wounds that made them give. They understand their fear of abandonment that made them stay longer than they should have. They acknowledge their need to feel needed. This self-awareness is not self-blame. It is empowerment. The empath stops trying to fix someone who refuses healing. This is one of the hardest realizations. Love cannot heal a person who does not want to confront themselves. Compassion cannot replace accountability. The empath learns that supporting someone does not mean sacrificing their own well-being. They begin to understand the difference between empathy and self-betrayal. This understanding marks the beginning of spiritual maturity. Instead of focusing on changing the narcissist, they turn inward. They ask themselves why they tolerated disrespect. They explore why chaos felt familiar. They choose growth over repetition. Spiritually, this is ascension. Not in a dramatic or mystical sense, but in a grounded and powerful way. The empath rises in awareness. They develop boundaries where there were none. They learn to say no without over-explaining. They recognize red flags earlier. Their compassion becomes balanced with discernment. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. This growth often comes through pain, but it leads to strength. The energy they once used to rescue others is redirected toward building their own stability. Meanwhile, as the empath ascends, the narcissist often faces the fall. The dynamic that once favored them shifts. The person who once chased now walks away. The one who once tolerated now refuses. This reversal can feel shocking, but the empath is no longer operating from unconscious patterns. They have seen the cycle clearly. They have named it. And once something is named, it loses its power to control. The awakening is not instant. There may be moments of doubt. There may be memories that try to rewrite the past in softer colors. But with time and reflection, the empath trusts their decision. They feel stronger standing alone than they did standing in constant emotional confusion. Their self-worth becomes internal instead of dependent on being needed by someone unstable. In the end, the greatest spiritual lesson in this dynamic is not about the narcissist's loss. It is about the empath's return to themselves. They stop shrinking to make someone else feel bigger. They stop explaining their pain to someone committed to misunderstanding it. They step into self-respect. And in doing so, they change the direction of their life. The cycle ends not because the narcissist transformed, but because the empath did. That is the true awakening. That is where the real power lies. When a narcissist loses an empath, the story does not end with separation. It enters a larger pattern governed by something many traditions describe as karma, consequence, or simply the law of return. Energy always returns, not in a mystical or dramatic way, but in a deeply psychological and spiritual sense. The way we treat others, the energy we extract, and the intentions we carry shape the internal world we eventually have to live inside. For narcissists, relationships often become cycles. They move from one partner to another, especially toward those who are empathetic, giving, and emotionally available. At first, the dynamic feels powerful, the admiration flows, the attention is steady, the validation feels endless. But over time, something subtle begins to shift. Each new cycle does not start from zero, it carries the residue of the previous one. The mask, which once felt solid and convincing, begins to crack faster. The charm may still appear, but it requires more effort. The patience of new partners may not last as long. The supply that once felt abundant becomes inconsistent. This is not coincidence, it is consequence. When someone repeatedly extracts emotional energy without giving genuine reciprocity, they weaken their own capacity for connection. They may not notice it immediately, but internally, something erodes. The narcissist often believes they are moving forward by replacing partners quickly. In reality, they are repeating a pattern that leads to diminishing returns. The first empath may have given years of patience. The next may give months. The next may recognize the red flags in weeks. With each repetition, the illusion becomes harder to maintain. The mask cracks faster because experience sharpens perception. The world does not respond the same way forever. Emotional gravity begins to pull. Spiritually, karmic law is not about punishment. It is about balance. If someone continuously takes without giving, imbalance grows, and imbalance cannot sustain itself indefinitely. What you extract without reciprocity depletes your own soul. This depletion is not visible in bank accounts or social media images. It is felt in the quiet moments. It is felt in the inability to form deep trust. It is felt in the growing restlessness that no amount of admiration fully satisfies. The narcissist may blame others for being too sensitive or too demanding, but the deeper issue is internal emptiness expanding over time. Avoidance accelerates this process. Instead of reflecting on why relationships collapse, the narcissist often shifts blame outward. They call former partners unstable, dramatic, or ungrateful. This protects the ego temporarily. Without reflection, patterns repeat, and repetition without awareness leads to deeper emptiness. Each unresolved lesson compounds. Each broken bond adds weight. This is spiritual gravity at work. The more you resist accountability, the heavier the inner world becomes. Meanwhile, something very different happens on the empath's path. Suffering, when faced honestly, strengthens awareness. The empath who leaves a narcissistic dynamic often goes through pain, confusion, and self-doubt. But if they reflect instead of repress, they grow. They learn boundaries. They recognize manipulation earlier. They value reciprocity. The same experience that the narcissist avoids becomes the empath's source of strength. Through suffering, they develop discernment. Through heartbreak, they build resilience. They become less likely to repeat the same cycle. This contrast highlights the law of emotional gravity. Growth requires facing discomfort. Avoidance creates stagnation. The empath chooses to confront pain and evolves. The narcissist avoids pain and becomes more hollow. Over time, the difference becomes visible. The empath's relationships become healthier and more balanced. The narcissist's connections become shorter and more superficial. The emptiness deepens not because fate is cruel, but because avoidance compounds. Karma, in this sense, is simply the natural result of repeated choices. When you repeatedly choose extraction over exchange, you train yourself to relate through control rather than connection. When you repeatedly choose pride over humility, you distance yourself from authenticity. These choices shape character, and character shapes destiny. The narcissist may continue finding new partners, new admiration, new supply. But if the inner pattern remains unchanged, the outcome remains similar. The satisfaction fades faster. The excitement diminishes quicker. The hunger grows stronger. Spiritual gravity ensures that imbalance corrects itself over time. It may not look dramatic. It may not happen instantly. But it operates quietly and consistently. Energy given returns as strength. Energy taken without care returns as emptiness. The empath, having endured and reflected, rises with greater self-awareness. The narcissist, having avoided and deflected, sinks deeper into isolation, masters superiority. In the end, karma is not revenge. It is reality unfolding through cause and effect. The universe does not need to punish anyone. Patterns carry their own consequences. Emotional gravity does not argue or negotiate. It simply pulls each person toward the natural result of their choices. And over time, that pull reveals who has grown through pain and who has grown emptier through avoidance. When a narcissist loses an empath, the event may look like a simple ending, but spiritually and psychologically it is a fork in the road. Something has cracked. The dynamic that once provided admiration, emotional supply, and reflection is gone. The familiar mirror has been removed. In that moment, the narcissist stands at a quiet but powerful crossroads. There are only two possible directions from here: destruction or individuation. The loss itself does not determine the outcome. The response does. The first path is the easier one. It begins with blame. The narcissist convinces themselves that the empath was the problem. They rewrite the story in a way that protects their pride. The empath becomes too sensitive, too demanding, or impossible to please. This narrative soothes the ego. It prevents the uncomfortable feeling of responsibility. From there, the next step is predictable new supply. Instead of sitting with the discomfort of loss, they seek another person who will provide admiration and validation. At first, it feels like relief. The attention restabilizes. The mask is adjusted and polished once again. But something subtle has changed. The crack that formed during the loss does not fully disappear. It is simply covered. To maintain control, manipulation may deepen. The narcissist may become more cautious, more strategic, even more charming in the beginning. Yet beneath that surface, fear has grown. Fear of being left again, fear of exposure. To prevent another collapse, the ego hardens. Vulnerability decreases. Control increases. What started as protection slowly becomes isolation. This is the path of destruction, not necessarily dramatic or immediate, but gradual. The relationships become more superficial. The connections lose depth. The inner emptiness, though ignored, expands quietly. The second path is far more difficult. It requires something the narcissist has long avoided: self-reflection. Instead of blaming, they pause. Instead of rushing toward new supply, they sit with the discomfort. They ask questions that threaten the ego. Why do my relationships follow the same pattern? Why do I feel unstable without constant validation? Why does abandonment trigger such intense anger or panic? These questions are not easy. They expose insecurity. They uncover old wounds, often rooted in early experiences of neglect, criticism, or emotional inconsistency. This is where therapy can become a turning point. Speaking honestly about fears and patterns requires humility. It requires admitting that the mask is not the whole self. For someone used to projecting strength, this step feels risky, but it is also freeing. As self-reflection deepens, shadow integration begins. Carl Jung described the shadow as the rejected parts of the personality, the traits we deny because they feel weak or shameful. For a narcissist, this often includes vulnerability, dependency, and fear of insignificance. Integrating the shadow does not mean becoming small, it means becoming whole. Jung believed that individuation is the highest goal of psychological development. Individuation is the process of becoming an integrated, authentic self rather than a collection of defenses and projections. And importantly, Jung taught that individuation often begins when the ego cracks. When the image we have built can no longer hold, we are forced to confront what lies beneath. Losing an empath can create exactly that crack. The steady admiration that supported the ego is gone. The illusion wavers. In that instability, there is opportunity. But only the brave walk through it. Facing the shadow requires courage. It requires acknowledging that the constant need for admiration was covering insecurity. It requires admitting that control was a shield against abandonment fear. It requires seeing the empath not as an enemy, but as someone who once reflected both light and darkness. This path does not guarantee perfection. It does not erase past harm, but it opens the possibility of genuine growth. The difference between these two paths is profound. On the first path, the narcissist becomes more rigid, more defensive, more disconnected from their authentic self. On the second path, they soften. They learn to tolerate vulnerability. They develop empathy not as performance, but as understanding. They build identity from within rather than from applause. One path leads to repetition and deeper emptiness. The other leads to integration and maturity. The loss of the empath is not random chaos. It is a moment charged with potential. The crack in the ego can either be sealed with thicker armor or widened into a doorway. The choice determines everything that follows. Destruction feels easier because it protects pride. Individuation feels harder because it challenges identity. Yet only one path leads to real stability. In the end, when the narcissist loses the empath, it is not just a breakup. It is the universe removing the mirror and forcing the soul to finally look within.